Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can I thank you for coming out? Ordinary people would be now underneath the duvet or in front of the television on a horrible day like this, so clearly you are not ordinary people, so thank you for being with us today at our Alternative Party conference. Can I just tell you quickly that it may or may not be germane to this conversation that I'm a Londoner, I'm a son of migrant. My father came here in the 50s. I live in London, I grew up in London, I went to school in London, I work in London, I go through Liverpool Street Station every day, and today I caught the Central Line at Liverpool Street Station going in completely the wrong direction. Which kind of shows you that even at my age you still do silly things. But thank you for being with us. We're going to spend 50 minutes together discussing the premise that Britain might be full. Is Britain full? Let me give you a couple of statistics that might inform that debate. The number of people living in Britain is projected to rise from 64.6 million, where it was in mid-2014, to 73.3 million in 2039. That's according to the Office for National Statistics. ONS again, they say net migration to the UK in the year ending March 2015, this March, was 330,000. That was an increase on the previous year of 28%. So that's some of the context. What is the effect of that? Well, according to The Economist, it gauges these things from time to time. It had a poll conducted by Ipsos Mori, and the result of that was that we learned that immigration is now one of the main concerns for Conservative voters, but also for Labour voters as well. It's now singled out by 50% of respondents as being among the most important matters that worry them. So that's some of the context. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to come to you for your questions, so if anything occurs to you during our discussion, then please make a note of it. But as you see, we have a stellar panel befitting of the Alternative Party conference, so let me just quickly introduce them to you. Sarah Rajeswaran is the Associate Director of Public Affairs at Edelman, which is the world's largest public relations firm. She was Deputy Head of Black and Minority Ethnic Research at the Policy Exchange and co-author of that unit's groundbreaking report, A Portrait of Modern Britain. Next to her is Douglas Murray. He is a British writer, journalist and commentator. He was the director of the Centre for Social Cohesion from 2007 to 2011. He is currently what we call in the trade a bigwig at The Spectator. And lastly, I'm not sure that's what he has on his calling card.
Yeah,
but
that is.
Okay. We also have with us Tulip Siddiq. She's the Labour MP for Hampstead and Kilburn. She's the Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group Against Anti-Semitism and a member of the Women and Equality Select Committee. Can I have a round of applause for our panel, please? Okay, so is Britain full? Let me give you the kind of quote that you hear quite a lot these days. What great states of the world other than Great Britain permit the immigration of destitute aliens without restriction? Should Her Majesty's government be prevented by any treaty obligations from making such regulations as shall put a stop to the free importation of destitute aliens into the United Kingdom? Those words were spoken by one Captain Colomb. He was the Conservative MP for Tower Hamlets in 1887. So what we're discussing now, plus you change. Douglas Murray, let me start with you. I'm going to ask you all to set out your stall, if you were, in a couple of minutes. So the notion, do you think Britain's full?
No, it's not. I have to say this is the most irritating thing for any panellist to do, I know, but let me just quibble with the framing of that, of this. Whether Britain is full or not is a sort of, I think, in a way, an unhelpful way to look at this. There is obviously space in the country. There are obviously all sorts of parts of the country you could build more houses on, and so on. And this is the same with all European countries. I think that, as it were, but of course that's not really what we mean when we talk about it. What we mean is, do people feel in the country that it is a country that can't take in any more people or shouldn't be taking them in at this rate and so on. My own view on this is that, and as I say, I'm assuming, because this is a Guardian event, that most of you are good Guardian readers and good left-wingers.
We're not all good.
Left-wingers,
I met
maybe.
a bad left-winger earlier. So let me put it to you this way. This seems to me to be a very, very big challenge for the left. Not that the right hasn't had its own tergiversations on this in recent decades, but that on the left this is a big problem, because broadly speaking, one can't get around the fact that, as Hugh said at the outset, public opinion consistently, actually, in recent years, has said that the public want less immigration than they currently have. A recent poll earlier this year showed a mere 7% of the British population wanting an increase in immigration. Then we have this, of course, problem, is that although that is public opinion, as I say, fairly consistently held, nevertheless, the parties, the main parties, struggle with this question still. They struggle in part, I would suggest, because of the problem of language in the area and what they promise, and what sounds tough, as opposed to what they can actually achieve, what can actually be done. And there's no better demonstration of that than the current government, which, of course, promised a few years ago to bring immigration down from the hundreds of thousands a year to tens of thousands, and, of course, has magnificently, obviously, not managed to do that. So I think there is a serious problem here. What happens not just when public opinion wants something and politicians keep on struggling with what to do and how to frame it, but also clearly politicians seem to be failing to actually do anything that responds to public opinion. And this, as I say, is a very large problem, and one which, if I may just make one other additional observation, one which is going to increase as a problem in the coming years, I think. I've been covering the so-called migrant crisis story quite a lot, and it is very striking that, of course, in the whole debate about immigration, we still struggle so hard in this country and other parts of Europe with talking about what we actually mean. Do we mean economic migration? Do we mean asylum? Do we mean people who want a better life and deserve a better life, and can we give it to them, and all these sort of things? Is that really, this is the area we're still struggling in. And the question of that being immigration doesn't do justice to it, and whether Britain is full certainly doesn't do justice to this, which is a much bigger issue, and I think, by the way, now a much bigger issue than any one government.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that. We can maybe start again and reframe the question or completely.
Sorry about that.
No, don't worry, you're allowed. This is The Guardian, free speech, comment is free. Tulip Siddiq.
I'll start off by saying I'm the daughter of a political asylum seeker. So my mother came here in the 1970s from Bangladesh because 19 members of her family had been killed in Bangladesh, and she moved here because it was simply too unsafe for her to go to Bangladesh, back to Bangladesh. She didn't move here because she's looking for a job. So immigration isn't simply an economic phenomenon. She moved to Hampstead and Kilburn, which is the area I represent, where 46% of my constituency is not British born. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this is because Hugh is right to say that 46% of the people who were surveyed before the election said immigration was their number one concern. Out of those people who responded, about 80% said they thought people came to this country looking for employment, and that's the main reason they moved here. If you look at Hampstead and Kilburn, which is the area I obviously know best, the Irish people who came to Kilburn, a lot of them, not every single one, but a lot of them did come because of employment for economic reasons. The Jewish community, which is very large in my constituency, came because they were fleeing political persecution from Nazi Germany back in the day. And that's the point I want to make. There is a perception of why people come into this country, and we do need to think about addressing that, not necessarily challenging it, but thinking about it and addressing it. And I think what we need to do, as a Labour Party and other mainstream parties, is not try to outdo UKIP on immigration. The problem is, for years and years, politicians, especially Labour politicians, didn't talk about immigration, and that allowed UKIP to set the terms of the debate. And I think that's very damaging for a country like ours, which has always been seen as a safe haven for a lot of people trying to come into the country to escape the world in which they can't go back. So I think we do need to talk about immigration. I think we need to dispel some of the myths. We need to talk about why people come into this country. I also think if we talk about Britain being full, let's think carefully. A UN report said Britain was the 140th most crowded country in the world. That's not at the top. And are we talking about London or are we talking about Britain? Yes, there is a problem with London. There is a lot of crowding in London. Part of that is because of the housing crisis. And the other thing is, we cannot blame the overstretching of public services on immigration. That's giving the government a free ride. So let's not do that.
Thank you, Julep. Sarah?
Hi. I feel like I need to say something about my background just because you and Julep have done the same. And I'd love to hear about Douglas's later on. But I'm the daughter of two immigrants who came here separately. My father came to Cambridge University in the 60s, and my mother came with her family to go to school, but her father had a job here. And I like to talk about my own journey being one of social mobility, because my parents started out my mother started out with 7 kids in a 2-bedroom in East London. They moved to Croydon, which from East London to Croydon is apparently going up in the world. And then I moved from Croydon to Clapham, which is, again, apparently going up in the world. But the whole way through my life, my parents talked about something which I think is sometimes lost in this conversation about whether Britain is full or not, but the buzzword through my life was integration. It always was. I grew up in Croydon in a time when actually I was the minority. I go back to Croydon now and everyone's Tamil, which is my background. But when I was growing up, I was one of 3 ethnic minority kids in my school. And my parents never wanted me to feel that. They made it very clear that I was Tamil and I had a heritage, but they made it very clear as well that they chose to come to the UK for different reasons and that we were British at the same time. And I think that within this debate about whether Britain is full or not, which, by the way, I agree with Douglas emphatically, I don't think it is, and Tulip, though I do think that we need to talk about making sure that the communities that are in the UK are integrated, both that they feel that they are welcomed in the UK, but also that they choose to integrate themselves. My mother's lived in Newham, where if you walk down the street now as a white British person, you are very much the minority and you feel as though you're the minority. And we need to discuss whether those sorts of things are good or bad and whether we need to bring more integration within our schools. But I don't think we should be necessarily talking about immigration as a good or a bad thing. We've seen recently with the NHS calling for more nurses and the fact that they can get more nurses from abroad. We still have need for immigration and for skills in the UK. There are jobs which white British people or British people in the UK aren't taking. So there's clearly a need that can be met. But at the same time, I don't want us to lose the idea that we need to talk about welcoming people and integrating them.
Okay, thank you very much. I didn't know that. Another person from Newham.
Yeah.
There we go. I'm going to reframe it slightly because, one, because the two of you poo-pooed it, but also because I think what might be helpful is if you say not so much is Britain full, but how much is too much? And when we say how much is too much, Douglas, and just for 10 minutes, I'm going to come to you, but for just for 10 minutes I'm going to let the panel maybe chew over this between themselves. What's the criteria of how much is too much? Is it, as you said, perceptional? Or is it, do we get to a point where the figures just say, hang on, overload, we just can't cope? What should we be looking at, and how do you make that decision?
It's obviously not a science, which is one of the reasons why it's actually plucking a figure, as David Cameron seemed to, of under 100,000 a year net migration, doesn't quite answer it. There is definitely an element of it which I think public services have to come into it, whether public services can provide adequately for everyone, including everyone who's already here. That's obviously a part of it. I think that the identity question is obviously a mellifluous one and obviously a highly problematic one, because as everybody knows, a lot of polls, a lot of data on this suggests, for instance, that a lot of people who live in really very monocultural areas nevertheless perceive immigration as happening quite often at a higher rate than it is actually happening. So there is definitely a problem about how you nail down the perception thing. I would just point this out, is that to my mind, the integration issue, which is just picked up on, is definitely part of this challenge. And has to be in there somewhere. And let me just, if I may, give a quick figure which is which I think is helpful. Quite often people talk about Britain and other European countries, and particularly Britain recently, as a nation of immigrants, which I think is a fallacy I always wish to sort of knock on the head. because although it's true that immigration has always happened, it's never happened at this kind of speed. And just to give some context for that, quite often people talk about the Huguenot migration into this country, the Huguenot migration in particular, to the east end of London. After 1683, around 50,000 Huguenots came to the UK. And this was such a large migration, as I say, not only that we still talk about it, but that it's still given as an example of, how integration happened. I mean, it took some centuries, arguably, I think not just decades, for that integration to occur, but that it has. But 50,000 is an average about 6 to 8 weeks of immigration that we've had over the last 15 years, since Tony Blair came to office and since that period. So,
What was it as a proportion of the population then?
Yeah, the proportion.
sure, but this question of what migration at that rate does, I would argue that the one criteria, as I say, it's not a scientific criteria, but one criteria has to be that issue of, are people coming and being part of the country, or are they coming and having a parallel life and a parallel community that they can do, and maybe not even being aware of the possible life they can have outside of that area. And when that happens, I think there is a problem. And I think it's one that people rightly get concerned about.
So that's not numbers, that's more cultural, and that's more a matter of integration, and more a matter of not how many people are coming, but how are we coping with the people who are coming.
Yes. I mean, I think a lot of people who have lots of concerns about immigration would not be as concerned as they were if integration had happened at a faster and better rate.
Okay. Sarah?
Well, I think we are one of the most integrated countries in the world, and other countries such as, Paris will look to London and say, we want this level of integration, that they have in the UK, though I completely hear your point that the largest concern often comes from people who do not meet someone from another ethnicity in their daily life. And it's what we all know is true, fear of the unknown. I would say an integration is the thing that I'm most concerned about. I think it, as I mentioned earlier, it cuts both ways. I think there are communities, and I could say it of my own, who, they come to the UK and then they hanker for the country they left in that time, and they hold it in aspect. And that's not a great thing. At the same time, it's wanting to be more welcomed into the community you come into. And I think that's where we get with this debate about immigration and whether it's good or bad. It makes migrant communities feel unwanted and unwelcome. And we have to be careful whilst talking about numbers, and I honestly don't know what the right number is. I don't think anyone does. But when you talk about numbers, you have to be careful with your rhetoric. You have to be careful with the actual message you're putting out to people and not making them feel like they're unwanted, because that won't help anyone. And that's when you get British-born people who feel that they don't belong to Britain.
Gillian, Douglas talked about perception, and you said that Labour perhaps didn't talk about immigration enough, and presumably you try and talk about it a bit more when you're on the doorstep. I'm sure as a hard-working MP, you're on a lot of doorsteps, and not just between elections. I'm sure you don't do that.
Wouldn't dream of it.
What do you say when a constituent says, problem here, we've just got too many immigrants, the country's full, we can't deal with them?
Well, I think the shock of my life was just before the election when I knocked on the door and a young black woman opened the door and said, there are too many immigrants in the country, so I'm not going to be voting Labour. And I said to her, and what about you? Like, didn't you come here many years ago? And she said, it's different. I work hard, I don't claim benefits, and it's been different for me. And I was like, okay, this is going to be a long conversation. And it was. But for me, when people speak to me and they say that Labour didn't speak much about immigration, one of the main complaints that comes up over and over again is that we didn't know who was in the country, and that's one thing people really fear. Like, how many people do we actually have in the country? Were we accountable for who came in and who didn't? Were our border controls strong enough to find out what kind of people were coming into the country? And this is something I do sympathise with. I do think we need to have some kind of border control where we find out who's coming into the country, because we want to allow people in who we welcome and contribute to life, but there's certain people we don't want in. We don't want every single person walking in. And the border controls, it doesn't help to make cuts to border agency staff, because I think you need to find out who's coming in. Saying that, I do not believe in a net migration target, which David Cameron has proposed. And frankly speaking, including refugees in that net migration target is immoral, and we shouldn't be doing it. But I also think one of the main problems is that you talked about people being stuck in one area, let's say, for example, of one community, 88% of ethnic minorities in this country are in the poorest boroughs in the country. So it's not so much that they gravitate towards a certain community because they want to. Sometimes there's no choice because of the lack of housing and how expensive housing is, especially in London. You talked about East London. Why do you think all the communities went there? It's because the housing was cheaper.
Sure.
What happens as a consequence is that the schools become pupils from just one community, and that's because that's your nearest school. So there are schools around, my area is very different, but around slightly outside, around Camden, where they'll have an entirely Bangladeshi community, like 98% will be people of Bengali origin in one school, and that's because of the housing problem. So I think about immigration, I don't think it's fair to say people gravitate just towards the communities. Also, I'm sure some do, but it's the cost of housing. It's then as a result of going to schools and not knowing anyone else outside your community.
If it's not sheer numbers, what is it that we should be doing that we're not doing in terms of integrating communities and in terms of perhaps diverting the resources towards those areas that need them the most? Because that's been seen to be a particular problem, hasn't it? If you think of parts of Kent that were very severely affected by various influxes and didn't have the money to deal with that. So to what extent is this governmental? Whichever of you want to pick that up and run with it can.
I'm going to start, but I'm going to start by almost not answering the question,
Again.
which is great. You always love panellists that do this. There is a lot that government can do, but there's also a lot that we can do at a cultural level. One of the things that I'm really interested in at the moment is the idea that you recently had it with Ofcom. They did a survey of ethnic minorities and how they felt they were represented in programming, publicly funded programming only. And you often found across the sort of the Black community, Black Caribbean and Black African community, that they felt that there were like more people of their own race and with their own background on television, but they were often in a really, really small subset of roles. They were often the criminal or the policeman that won't play by the rules. There were Indians complained about always being the people that were owning the corner shop or the doctor. And I'm not saying that these stereotypes don't exist, but at the same time, what it doesn't do is open people's minds to what else they could do. You know, young children watching this programming, and they're seeing, they're having their ideals and aspirations penned in by what they're seeing. And you think it might sound a bit trite, but actually it's where a lot of young people get their aspiration from the world around them, from what they see. And you'll find that, you know, many, many different actors have spoken about moving to the US, because in the US, their casting tends to be far more colourblind. They just don't particularly care. And they'll cast the best person that walks in that day in the role. And I think that there's a lot that we can do as society to integrate better, and then there's often more that government can do.
But doesn't government have a hand in that in terms of shaping people's perceptions? They can't tell you how to think.
Yeah.
But of course, one of the things that they do, when it suits them, of course, and that's all governments, is they seek to shape public perceptions. And have they done that in this area to the public benefit?
I'm not sure they have. I think this. There's an oddity about the immigration discussion, which is that people. You very often hear people saying, "It's time we had a discussion about immigration," and then somebody else said, "But we seem to be always discussing it," you know. But the truth is that there is something strange about the political discussion, I think, in this area. I have a theory that only the left and only the Labour Party, you'll be pleased to hear this, Tulip, only the Labour Party can actually ever address this properly.
We need to get back in government.
And
You'll have to get a different
Douglas
leader.
will help you.
But I do, because there is undoubtedly a fear on the Conservative side around this subject. You can see it even with what I thought was a rather mild-mannered speech, really, by Theresa May at the Conservative Party conference.
Not sure about that.
Which was it was given an amazingly, you know, vituperative reception outside of the hall. But it actually,
even by Tories.
And even by Tories, yeah. Which I thought was surprising, because she didn't actually say anything particularly that lots of other people haven't said, including Labour MPs. But there's undoubtedly a problem for the right on this, and they're concerned about it. And so arguably the only party that could possibly satisfy, as it were, to answer public concern about this, answer the legitimate public concern about it, and not have that fear would be the Labour Party. But that's why I say this is an interesting time for this discussion to be going on the left, because this obviously has to be answered to. You lose voters on this issue. And you've obviously got to come up with some answers on it. If I can just say very quickly, by the way, I mean, you mentioned some other examples of other countries. I mean, it is very striking. If you go to France, I mean, if you go to France and spend any time there, you will think, my gosh, we've done integration well in the UK. And by the way, and just one other thing, which is on that issue of, as it were, representative role models. I mean, there is an oddity about this as well, isn't there? Which is, I spent quite a lot of time in the United States, and I've been very struck during the Obama presidency, which a lot of us thought, well, thank goodness that's going to, ease that in America. Actually, the opposite seems to have happened. And so, even when there's a black president...
He's hit by him being there, it's actually polarised the debate somewhat, because it's the parts of the US political debate, let's say, do you tend to go, oh, well, he's not your typical Democrat, he's a black president, he's going to do this sort of thing, which I think you found to some extent amongst the most right wing of the Republicans.
If government have a role, then I'd like you to give me some idea of what a Labour government, when you're leading a Labour government, or obviously maybe from officially or just piloting it from the sidelines, how you will do things. But just to quickly pick up that point that Douglas made about whether or not Labour are the only, attitudinally Labour are the only ones who can deal with this. Let me just give you a quote. We hold that it's in the interest of the British people that the reputation of Britain for good faith and humanity should be preserved. That was Edward Heath talking about the Ugandan nations and whether or not that they should be allowed and how we should deal with that. So in the past, Conservative politicians have made different noises, haven't they?
Sure.
Tulip,
I think the Labour Party does have a responsibility to address this immigration. I don't think it's the only party that does, but I think they have a big role to play, and I don't think they've done it very well. And I was asked during the election, would I drink out of the mug that says controls on immigration? And I said I would smash it. So no, I wouldn't be drinking out of it.
No controls at all?
Look, there's controls the way I've talked about it, where we find out who comes into the country. There's certain people we don't want in the country. But controls on immigration as a blanket policy, no, I don't agree. I'll say a few things, though, I do think we could do. One is we could work with local councils. I used to be a local councillor. Local councils know their patch very well. And in Brent, there is in a school where they suddenly noticed there was a huge influx of people coming from Afghanistan and Kazakhstan, they decided to set up a service inside the school where the parents of the children coming in could start to speak English. It was a local initiative that really worked, and it meant that people knew more about public services, but also knew how to speak English, knew how to integrate into the communities. The small things you can do like that. You can also work on the Impact Fund, which has been floated a few times with Yvette Cooper, in areas where if refugees are coming in or there's a huge influx of people coming in from outside, you want to give them some money to find out how we can settle these people, then yes, that's something I think we can do as a government. But what we really need to do, and this is I think what aggravates people the most, is the fact that they are dodgy employers who exploit immigration for their own benefits, and they make sure that workers are paid under the table, or they're people who come in who are desperate to work, and dodgy employers will take advantage of this. And no government has been very strong in cracking down on this, and that's something we should be doing.
Okay, I think Douglas wants to come. Go ahead, feel free.
Could I just ask a very quick question of Tulip, because I think this helps us to get to part of the nub of the issue. It's very easy on the immigration issue, as we all know, to say, motherhood and apple pie sort of thing. But you just mentioned something very important, which is that there are people we don't want. Who are the people we don't want?
Well, I mean, if you are known to be a criminal who in your own country is then trying to escape because you have actually done something wrong, then why would we welcome them into this country?
I'm not arguing for them, but I mean, other than the criminal class, as it were.
Who do you think we don't want?
Why? Who wouldn't you want?
I think it's sort of incumbent on politicians to address it. Now, I think, for instance, that a large import of people to do jobs, as you say, that this is a very concerning one. The argument that we need, for instance, mass immigration because there are jobs that people in Britain won't do troubles me enormously. No, of course. but it is a troubling area, and it's always seemed to me unwise to import a working class because something will happen to your working class.
Okay.
And it'll become an underclass, a passed over class, or all sorts of other things. So, I mean, to my mind, that would be one of the things I would address first.
Okay, well, I don't want criminals in the country, but I also don't want people who don't abide by the rules. I mean, that's quite simple, isn't it? You come into this country, you're taking advantage, and you don't abide by the rules. I don't want those people. What I don't want to do, I'm just going to make this point, is our higher education economy in this country relies on international students. Okay, they pay a lot of money, they come into the country, they help our economy. To scrap things like the post-work study visa means there's been a 38% drop in international students coming here. We're shooting ourselves in the foot by doing that. Those are the people I do want. I don't want people who come here, health tourism or whatever it's called, and then people taking advantage of the system. They're the same people you probably don't want in the country. So those are the people I don't want. I just don't think we can have one straight blanket policy. These are the people we don't want, don't come into the country.
Tulip, thank you very much. Let me open it up. The keenest and the first, you, sir. There's a mic coming up to you, although I'm not sure you need it. But have it all the same.
Which is a compliment.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Martin. I'm English
Okay.
for many generations, so but hopefully I can still speak on this subject.
No, it's all
as someone who's lived abroad, I actually believe very much in the ability to move. So I've got two things to say. One was a fact, and the other is a question. So the first is the fact, which is that the population over the last 20 years has gone up 7.1 million.
Okay.
6.3 million of that is in people over 40,
Right.
and only 0.7 is people under 40. Most of the immigration that's come on has been filling up as people have got older and we're living longer. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions and misunderstanding about this whole issue, is that actually, there's suddenly this wave of young immigrants coming in. Yes, there are, but they're just filling up, and it's not. Our biggest population increase is people not dying, which is great news in many ways. But it's
Yes, don't knock it.
I don't want to knock it, but it is. And sorry, and then my question is this whole issue about control. If you suggested that I needed permission and to be controlled if I wanted to move to Yorkshire, I would consider you an authoritarian, completely unacceptable government. But for any government to suggest that people moving from country to country need to be controlled just is the matter of standard political discourse. And I do struggle with that. We've gone into this position. Mm-hmm. So what does the panel think about that control point and whether we should control?
Okay, just quickly, should we be so sniffy about the very concept of controls? Sarah?
Well, I think the fundamental difference is that if you move from London to Yorkshire, you wouldn't be in a different political structure, you wouldn't be in a different tax structure, you would remain a citizen of the United Kingdom, supported by the state and paying into the state, whereas were you to move to a different country as a permanent resident, that wouldn't be the case. Mm. And that's why countries seek to control that, because they have a responsibility to their current citizens and what their future of their country looks like.
Yes, I mean, it's a very good point about the first point. It's true, it seems to have come to as a shock to many politicians. Immigrants get old as well. Extraordinary, unforeseeable fact. But the point you make then about borders is I think, a great error, as has already been said. I mean, obviously, a country has its own borders for very clear reasons, and nations need borders between each other for very clear reasons. And if you doubt the necessity of those reasons, just travel anywhere in Central toward Eastern Europe at the moment. What is happening? Borders are going back up because the dream of completely free movement, and Schengen is screwed, in case you're not aware of that now. It's impossible. They're not doing it. And even where the borders aren't going back up, effectively borders are going back up. Because nations need to have a say about who is in and who is not.
Okay. I'm going to take another question, and I'll come to you first with it. You in the front there. The microphone is winging its way towards you.
Hello. I'm from Spain, and I've been in this country for 29 years. Okay. I ran a business for 27 years. I found it enormously difficult to find English people to work. It was a cafe.
They don't come, or when they
because they just didn't consider it worthy enough. 90% of my staff was international.
Okay.
Another thing, the press has an enormous paper on how to change people's perception about, shape people's perception about immigration. The Sun, we are swamped. In The Guardian, more people have left England to go to other countries that people from abroad have come to England.
Okay, I want to get as many questions in as I can, so let me frame that to two.
So, why are we the cause of all problems
Okay.
in England?
That's a perceptional question, isn't
It's
it?
more a perception
I
than a
think
reality.
the media has a big role to play, and there is a lot of right-wing papers which definitely exaggerate how many people are in the country, but also how many Muslims are taking over the country. That's quite a spectacular headline that comes up quite often. I'll just say something. I don't know about the particular business that you ran. A lot of the problems in this country come from the fact that work doesn't pay because the wages are so low, especially in London. I mean, I know we have a national minimum wage, but the London living wage has got to start coming into effect because people just feel like they can't work because half the time they're paying for their rent or paying for their children or paying for their cost of living. And I think we have to have something like the London living wage and living wage in other cities. I speak about London because I'm a London MP, but other cities as well where work has got to pay in order for people to actually want to go to work.
Sarah, is it about the money? Because you do hear that, the same point made by the lady there quite a lot. Employers will say, I'd love to employ more British people, but I get them in and they don't last or they don't turn up. And I employ migrants because they just work harder and they're more reliable.
I do think a lot of it is about the money. I think that that's where the greatest root cause is. I mean, people will throw about ideas that immigrant populations are harder working than native British. I don't know if that's true. I personally haven't seen it being true. I know that your experience is that you haven't been able to get white British people to fill the jobs that you've got. But I would probably agree more with Tulip than with that assumption.
I'm going to take another question. The lady there, and then I'm going to come to you.
I just want to ask the panel, is there a reason that we don't, when we're talking about immigration, that it's not strictly followed by our foreign policy?
That we don't combine the two? That we don't,
Yeah, because
contextualise
we
the
have
two?
to, you mentioned that you had a wave of Afghanistan children coming. There might have been a reason for that. That wasn't coincidence. So we have to look at what Britain is doing to the rest of the world, to why we're having sways of people. If we're forcing our ideals on the rest of the country and we're telling the world of how brilliant to live here is, then maybe that message is going to them and them wanting to come here.
Okay, I'm going to try and take as many questions as I can. So, Douglas, just quickly deal with that. Do we talk about the context enough?
That's a very interesting point. It's got a slight flaw in it, which is that, for instance, incidentally, by the way, our biggest obligations consistently, to my mind, never get lived up to. Take the Afghan translators struggling to get asylum in the UK. It's shameful. Shameful. They should be the first people in. But as for, as it were, I think what you're saying also is as it were, if our foreign policy is connected to this and so on. Well, yes and no. I mean, this country has had no meaningful involvement in the Syrian civil war, has it? Yet it is waves of Syrians that are trying to come into Europe at the moment and obviously form the bulk of, I think, of legitimate asylum seekers. But even in that case, by the way, that is a minority part of the migration we're currently seeing into Europe. If you travel to places like Lampedusa and other of the islands, Italy and Greece, were the main reception points, main entry points. Actually, Syrians form a minority of this. Most of the people, by my observation, are coming from sub-Saharan Africa. Has anyone in this country, has this country had any involvement in Eritrea? No. But well, yeah. But then you could go back indefinitely if you want to do that. You say any country that has ever had any financial dealings with the UK we're responsible for. I don't think the British people would follow you on that one.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I just want to add in that. I mean, we need to be careful not to mix up, although it's part of it, but not to mix up immigration with asylum seekers and refugees, because they represent, I think, just over 0.25% of immigrants to the UK every year. And it really, really concerns me when we think about immigration and think it's, you know, everybody from Syria or Afghanistan or Eritrea, which are our largest base of refugees. Also, the ONS published some incredible statistics, and I was looking at them this morning, which have a lovely map with it. I would definitely recommend it. Where over the last 2 years, our largest base of inflows, so the country where most of the people came from, was China. And I don't think we're necessarily pushing our ideals on the Chinese. It might be the other way around. Also, over the last 15 years, since 1992, out of the top 15 countries that have represented the largest inflow of people every year to the UK, there are only 3 countries that have been in it for every year of the last 15 years. And they were the United States, Australia, and Germany. So when we think about this mass of immigrants coming here, it's not necessarily the people that are visibly different from the white British population. And I think that that's really important to bear in mind.
Okay, you sir.
Hello. To keep the theme, my grandmother emigrated from Belgium. No, great-grandmother. So you've sort of spoken a lot, and it's the classic thing. This sort of feels like a very southern-based look at this, and it's sort of going, Britain isn't full, absolutely not, but London is full. And it's sort of going, the capacity's up there somewhere. But the problem is, like me, from the Lake District, I'm immigrating to the south because there's no work up there. So I'm wondering, how do you deal with that, the issue that the south is draining from our north? And if we put immigrants up there, there isn't a capacity for them, perhaps, in terms of work.
A 30-second answer, and my answer to you is that you come to our debate later today, which is London versus the UK. Yeah, that's the easiest plug I've ever had.
I'll just be very quick on this because I'm being told I have 30 seconds. But look, a lot of the reasons why people come to London from other parts of the world is because if you want to do anything in politics, for example, you've got to be in London because all the internships, all the apprenticeships, Parliament is based here. And I've been told for media it's the same thing. You've got to come down to London if you want to make it. So there is a problem about people in certain industries coming down to London because it's the only place they'll get a job and work and housing, which is probably looks like you. That's why you came here as well. So there is a problem with that. But also, I suppose it's also about our main problem in London. The overcrowding has come from a lack of building houses. That is the main problem. And people selling flats to overseas buyers who just buy without a mortgage, and the councils have absolutely no power to restrict that sale of property. And as a local councillor before, that really used to get to me.
So again, when you think about the numbers, you also have to think about public policy. Right at the back, women at the back, I can't see properly
It's a
who
man,
it
I
is, so
think.
I'm not even going to guess. Yes, sir.
If the politicians wish to discuss control of immigration, they can't, unless we leave the EU, control immigration from the EU. And I hear very little, other than from Nigel Farage, to make that point.
Okay.
But the other thing I would say is that over the many years in which since I immigrated to this country, have been looking at these things, we have managed to build large numbers of houses, 300,000 a year at one stage. We have managed to build a very large number of school places, a huge number when we raised the school leaving age.
I really do need a question, sir, because we need to get out.
My question is, why have we never heard those sorts of responses when the politicians are challenged?
Thank you very much, sir. So, is there much point having this discussion from within the EU? Very quickly.
Of course, the EU is a large part of our immigrant stock, but it's about 45% and about 45%, and another 45% of people not from the EU. Saying that, obviously, we've seen with David Cameron's pledge to reduce immigration from the hundreds of thousands to the tens of thousands, that one of the reasons why he couldn't meet that was because of our membership of the EU. Saying that, we're not alone. We're not the only country in the EU struggling with borders. Germany itself, and you don't hear much of it from Angela Merkel in the UK, but if you speak to German policymakers and people involved in German politics, this is as active a debate in Germany as it is in the UK.
Okay, I want to stop you there. Quickly,
Absolutely, a very important point to make about the EU. No, we can't really control our borders whilst we're in the EU, and I think a renegotiation of some kind is obviously necessary. Very quickly, if I may, by the way, one of the reasons why when people say we need to debate immigration and so on, whilst it's tedious, it's also absolutely vital. I'm going to give a very quick example of why. Last month, Angela Merkel was unfortunately caught in a hot mic moment in New York at the UN. She was sitting beside Mark Zuckerberg at lunch, and she was unfortunately caught with her mic on. She sat down to lunch beside Mark Zuckerberg, and the first thing she said was, "What can we do to stop people writing anti-immigration things on Facebook?" And Zuckerberg said, "We're working on it." And I put my head in my hands when I thought, if you want this to blow, that would be how you do it. Stop discussion of it.
Okay, I'll have to stop you there, Tulip, very, very quickly, please.
Renegotiation is fine within the EU, but we must stay in the EU. 3 million of our jobs is linked to us being in the EU, and also think about all the Brits who are in the EU as well, who go to other countries. So it's not just people from outside coming into us. We go and live in countries in Europe as well. In terms of trade, investment, employment, we've got to stay in the EU. But renegotiation is something I do agree with. I think we need to make the deal better for us, but don't forget about all the Brits who are living in other countries inside the European Union.
Can I thank you all? Can I have a round of applause for our panel, please? Sarah Ragheswaran, Tulip Siddiq and Douglas Murray, thank you for your questions as well.
Can I take a picture for my
Your
blog?
contributions will be very necessary if The Guardian is ever to return to government, so thank you for
Sorry,
being
not 3
here
million.
today.
What was the figure? It is
Enjoy
3
the
million,
rest
isn't
of
it?
your day.
Not
and
3
goodbye.
million.
We're talking about the new politics. It's become the phrase of the hour. A lot of people will have seen you on that day when the new politics emerged into the light, September the 12th. AD, when Jeremy Corbyn was announced as Labour's new leader, and there you were singing the red flag with him. So my question to you is, how new is the new politics?